All right, welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive.
Always.
Today, we're tackling something that sounds simple on the surface but gets super complex quickly. Intrinsic versus extrinsic properties.
It's one of those concepts we use all the time without really thinking about it.
Totally. Like, we just kind of know that some things are about the object itself, and some things are about how it relates to everything else.
Exactly. But philosophers have been debating this for centuries. It gets into some really fundamental questions about, well, existence itself.
And for this deep dive, our main source is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on intrinsic versus extrinsic properties. Full disclosure, this one's a brain bender.
Oh, yeah. Get ready for some serious mental gymnastics.
Okay, so before we get lost in the philosophical weeds, let's start with the basics. What exactly are intrinsic and extrinsic properties? I mean, in simple terms, like you're explaining it to someone who's never heard of these concepts before.
All right, so imagine you have an apple. Just a regular, delicious apple.
I love apples.
Now, some of the apple's properties are about the apple itself, regardless of anything else, its mass, for instance.
Okay, so like how much the apple weighs.
Exactly. That's an intrinsic property. It's inherent to the apple no matter where it is or what's around it. Same with its chemical composition, or maybe even its shape, though philosophers argue about that one.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. So intrinsic is like the apple's essence, the stuff that makes it that apple.
You got it. Now think about something like the apple's distance from a tree.
Ah, okay, so that would change depending on where you put the apple.
Exactly. That's an extrinsic property. It's not about the apple in isolation, but about its relationship to something else. Being someone's favorite fruit, being in a basket, all those are extrinsic.
So extrinsic is all about context, relationships, stuff like that.
You got it. But here's where things get really tricky. Even these seemingly simple examples raise tough questions.
Like what? Give me an example. I'm ready to have my mind blown.
Well, let's go back to the apple's shape. Some philosophers argue that even shape isn't truly intrinsic.
Wait, really? Why not?
Yeah.
It seems pretty fundamental to the apple itself.
Well, think about it. Does the apple's shape depend on the space it's in? Does it depend on the observer? What if you looked at it under a microscope? Would its shape stay the same?
Ooh, I see what you mean. It starts to get a little fuzzy, right?
Exactly. And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because it turns out there are different flavors of intrinsicality, each with its own nuances. Our intuitions might pull us in different directions here.
Different flavors. Okay, now you've really piqued my curiosity. This is where I think I'm going to need that extra cup of coffee.
I hear you. All right, imagine we're at a philosophical ice cream parlor. First flavor up. Local versus non-local properties.
Okay, that sounds intriguing. What's the difference?
Think about it this way. It's all about how you describe the property. Can you describe it by only talking about the object itself? If so, it's local.
So like this apple is red. We're not mentioning anything else. That would be local.
Bingo! You nailed it. But if you have to bring in other things to describe the property, it's non-local. This apple is bigger than that orange, for example. You're immediately relating it to something else.
Ah, got it. So local is all about the object's own characteristics, and non-local involves comparing it to something else.
Exactly. Now, ready for another scoop? We've also got interior versus exterior properties. This one gets into what the property depends on. Does it come from inside the thing itself, or is it caused by something external?
Okay, so like if I dye my hair blue, that blueness is an exterior property because it came from the dye, not from my hair's natural state.
You're on a roll. That's exactly right. And this idea of exterior properties gets tangled up with some deep philosophical questions about cause and effect, what philosophers call metaphysical grounding.
Metaphysical grounding. Okay, now we're getting fancy.
It's just a fancy way of asking what explains what. What's the source of a property? But trust me, it gets really complex quickly.
I can imagine. So 2 flavors down. Any more scoops of intrinsicality for us?
Oh, there's one more, and it's real mind-bender. Ready for this? Duplication preserving properties.
Duplication preserving. Okay, you're going to have to break that one down for me.
Imagine you could create a perfect duplicate of something in a different world. Would that duplicate have to have the same property?
So like mass would be duplication preserving, right? Because a duplicate apple in another world would also have to have mass. But being my favorite apple wouldn't be unless my duplicate in that other world also had the exact same tastes as me.
Precisely. And that's where it gets philosophically interesting, because what if some properties are simply impossible to duplicate? What would that tell us about their nature?
Whoa. Okay, that one's going to need some time to sink in. So we've got all these different ways to think about what makes a property intrinsic. Does that mean there's no single right answer?
That's the beauty and the challenge of philosophy. We can describe the concept, we can analyze it from different angles, but pinning down a precise definition, that's where things get really tricky. It's like trying to catch smoke.
So maybe intrinsicality is more of a spectrum than a black and white category. Like some properties are more intrinsic than others.
That's one way to think about it. And this all ties into some really fundamental questions about what exists, about the nature of reality itself.
Okay, my brain is officially starting to hurt, but in a good way. I feel like we've just scratched the surface here.
Oh, we've only just begun. But I think this is a good place to pause and let everyone digest these initial concepts.
Agreed. And when we come back, we'll delve even deeper into why all of this matters. Why should anyone care about intrinsic versus extrinsic properties?
Because, believe it or not, it has huge implications for how we understand everything from ethics to the nature of change itself.
Ooh, I can't wait. This is going to be good.
So you're probably thinking, okay, that's cool and all, but why should I care about this intrinsic versus extrinsic stuff?
Right. Like, does it really matter for anything outside of abstract philosophical debates?
Oh, it absolutely matters. As you see, once you start thinking in terms of intrinsic and extrinsic properties, it changes how you see the whole world. It has huge implications for things like ethics, the nature of change, even what it means to be you.
Okay, you've officially hooked me. I'm ready to have my worldview shattered.
Great. Let's start with ethics. Think about the concept of value. What makes something valuable? Why do we care about certain things and not others?
Right, like why do we value human life or art or nature?
Exactly. And that's where intrinsic value comes in. Something with intrinsic value is valuable in and of itself. It doesn't depend on its usefulness to us or its relationship to other things.
So like, if you believe that nature has intrinsic value, you're saying it's not just valuable because it provides resources for humans, but it has worth on its own just because it exists.
Exactly. And that has huge implications for how we think about our ethical responsibilities. If something has intrinsic value, does that mean we have a moral duty to protect it? Does it change how we should interact with it?
I see how that gets into some really deep territory. So intrinsicality is basically the foundation of our entire moral system.
Well, maybe not the foundation, but it's definitely a key building block. It helps us understand what we value and why, and it forces us to confront tough questions about our place in the world.
Okay, that's ethics.
Hmm.
What about those other big implications you mentioned, like the nature of change? What does intrinsicality have to do with that?
Ah, yes, the problem of change. This one's a real head-scratcher. How do things change over time while still remaining the same thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago, but I'm still me somehow, right?
Exactly. And that's where intrinsic and extrinsic properties come in. Think about it. If every property of something changed, would it still be the same thing?
I guess not. I mean, if every single thing about me changed, I wouldn't be me anymore, would I?
Right. So some philosophers argue that there must be some intrinsic properties that remain constant over time, even as extrinsic properties change.
So, like, my DNA stays the same, even though my haircut and my opinions might change.
Exactly. Or maybe it's something even more fundamental, like the basic structure of your consciousness or your soul, if you believe in that sort of thing.
Okay, so intrinsicality helps explain how things can change while still remaining themselves.
It's one way to think about it, but it also raises some really mind-bending possibilities, like what if only your extrinsic properties changed? Would you still be you?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I mean, if all my relationships changed and all my experiences were different, would I still be the same person at my core?
That's exactly the kind of question that philosophers who study intrinsicality grapple with. And it gets even more complicated when you consider something called supervenience.
Supervenience. Okay, now you're just making up words.
I promise it's a real word. It basically means depends on.
Lots of philosophical theories try to explain how one set of facts depends on another set of facts.
Okay, I think I'm following. Give me an example. Sure. Think about the relationship between your mind and your brain. Many philosophers believe that your mental states, your thoughts, feelings, experiences depend on the physical state of your brain. That's a type of physicalism.
So, like, my happiness is just a bunch of neurons firing in a particular way?
Well, it's more complex than that, but you get the idea. Your mental facts, in this view, supervene on your physical facts. They depend on them.
Okay, so what does this have to do with intrinsic and extrinsic properties?
Well, some philosophers argue that supervenience only works if the fundamental properties are intrinsic. In other words, the facts that everything else depends on have to be about the things themselves, not just about their relationships to other things.
So, like, if everything supervenes on physical facts, then those physical facts better be intrinsic.
Exactly. Otherwise, the whole system kind of falls apart. It's like trying to build a house on a foundation of sand. It's just not going to hold up.
Okay, I think I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Yeah.
Intrinsicality is about more than just defining what's essential to a thing. It's about understanding the very structure of reality.
You're getting it. It's about figuring out what's fundamental, what's ground level, what everything else depends on. And that's why it's so important, not just for philosophers, but for anyone who wants to understand the world around them.
I'm completely mind blown. I never realized how much depth there was to this whole intrinsic versus extrinsic thing. So we've talked about ethics and change and supervenience. What else? Is there anything intrinsicality doesn't touch?
Uh-huh. It seems like it pops up everywhere once you start looking for it. But there's one more big question we need to tackle. Can we actually define intrinsicality? Or is it one of those concepts that we intuitively grasp but can't quite pin down with a precise definition?
Ooh, that's a good one. Like, we've been talking about it this whole time, but do we even really know what it is?
That's the million-dollar question. And as you might expect, philosophers have come up with a lot of different answers. Some are more convincing than others, but it's a really tough nut to crack.
Let's crack it open, shall we? I'm ready to see how philosophers have tried to define the undefinable. Okay, so spill the beans. How have philosophers tried to nail down a definition for intrinsicality?
Well, one approach is to focus on this idea of perfect naturalness.
Perfect naturalness. What's that all about?
The basic idea is that intrinsic properties are the most fundamental properties of reality, the ones that everything else depends on.
So like the building blocks of existence. If we could just figure out what those fundamental building blocks are, we'd have the key to intrinsicality.
Exactly. And some philosophers, like David Lewis, thought that this was the right way to go. Figure out the perfectly natural properties and everything else falls into place.
That sounds almost too simple.
Oh.
Are there any problems with this approach?
Oh, there are definitely some challenges. For one thing, how do we even know what those perfectly natural properties are? Physicists have their theories, of course, but even those are constantly evolving. And what if there aren't any perfectly natural properties? What if reality is just layers upon layers of complexity with no ultimate foundation?
Yeah, that would make things a bit tricky. So what are some other ways philosophers have tried to define intrinsicality?
Another approach is to focus on this idea of non-disjunctivity.
Non-disjunctive.
Non-disjunctivity, it's a mouthful, I know. But the basic idea is that intrinsic properties can't be broken down into simpler parts.
So they're kind of like the prime numbers of properties.
Yeah.
Indivisible.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You can't express an intrinsic property as a combination of other properties. It's like the fundamental ingredient in a recipe. You can't break it down any further.
Okay, I think I'm getting that. But are there any issues with this approach? It seems like every time we get close to a definition, we hit another snag.
Well, you're not wrong. Even with this non-disjunctive approach, there are still some tricky questions, like how do we know which properties are the truly fundamental, indivisible ones? And some philosophers argue that this approach, while helpful, doesn't quite capture everything we intuitively mean by intrinsic.
It's like trying to grab hold of a philosophical greased pig. So we talked about perfect naturalness and non-disjunctivity. What other attempts have philosophers made to wrangle this concept?
Well, there's one more we haven't mentioned yet. Contractionist theories.
Contractionist. Now that sounds ominous.
It's not as scary as it sounds. The basic idea is this. Imagine you could shrink the world down to just a single object. Whatever properties that object still has, even when it's completely isolated from everything else, those are its intrinsic properties.
It was like a philosophical thought experiment.
Yeah.
Stripping away all the external stuff, all the relationships and context to see what's left at the object's core.
Precisely. But even this seemingly simple thought experiment raises some tough questions. Like, can we even imagine an object existing without a world around it? And doesn't that active imagination already presuppose some understanding of what's intrinsic?
It feels like we're going in circles.
Yeah.
So after all these attempts to define intrinsicality, where do we end up? Do we have a clear answer?
Well, that's the thing about philosophy. Sometimes the journey is more important than the destination. We may not have a single, universally agreed upon definition of intrinsicality, but in the process of trying to define it, we've explored some really deep questions about the nature of reality, about the relationship between objects and their properties, about what it means for something to exist.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. It's like we've been on this incredible intellectual adventure, and even though we haven't found a treasure map with an X marking the spot, we've discovered all sorts of amazing things along the way.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will be the one to finally crack the code of intrinsicality.
Or maybe it's one of those mysteries that's meant to keep us pondering and exploring.
Perhaps. But one thing's for sure, the world is a much more interesting place when we start paying attention to these seemingly simple distinctions, like intrinsic versus extrinsic. It makes you realize how much we take for granted and how much there still is to discover.
Well said. Well, folks, that's our deep dive into the fascinating world of intrinsic versus extrinsic properties. We hope you enjoyed the journey as much as we did.
And remember, keep those philosophical gears turning. You never know what mind-bending mysteries you might uncover in your everyday life.
Until next time, happy philosophizing.